Examining Fear, Part 2. What is fear? And how can we determine which of those feelings are signals from the instinctive aspects of self-preservation and which stem from reinforced pattern-based behaviors? Fear can be retrospective, immediate, or predictive, yet it is not constrained by time. Guilt is a fear of what has happened and is primarily retrospective and from a learned experience. Fears have no sense of time themselves, so these fears experienced and learned from past events are processed in the present or in the now. Primal panic, fear of what is happening now. This is primarily reflexive and activated by the amygdala, providing strong impulses to act. This sudden and strong imperative to act that can so easily override our cognitive processes is part of the primal panic mechanism. This is also known as amygdala hijacking. The amygdala hijacking is very important to understand as it is a phenomenon that we will encounter often when introducing certain types of people to unfamiliar ideas and concepts. Learning to recognize a hijack can help mitigate or diffuse the fear response that overrides rationality, as well as assisting in better communication with those who are in the throes of one. Anxiety. This is also a learned response, but one which may or may not be the direct result of past experience. Fear of what may happen, or the future, is primarily predictive and activated when the feelings of insecurity are present. Much like trauma, fear is not constrained by time, so anxiety of the future and what may happen is also processed in the now. Running closely behind depression, anxiety is one of the most prevalent emotional disorders in our society today. Typically, what we call fear is a complex experience which draws upon our sense of vulnerability, that is, the probability and magnitude of risk and our ability to mitigate or manage that risk. The more aware, capable, and equipped one is, the less this tends to impact us. Ergo, lack of confidence is, of course, a big factor in our sense of vulnerability. Because the ability to mitigate or manage risk is based on us at an individual level, it is also thought by existential psychologists that ultimately this type of fear is the burden of being responsible and accountable for the outcome of our lives. So, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the perceived threat to our safety and survival, be it physical, emotional, or material. We experience vulnerability most often as a fear in one of three guises, that of guilt, panic, and anxiety. Vulnerability is something that resides deep within us, which perceives a certain external or emotional circumstance as a risk to the developmental needs of our most primary selves. Consequently, the sense of threat is directly linked to the risk of the denial or removal of one of our more critical developmental needs, such as acknowledgement, understanding, acceptance, love, nurturing, etc. Vulnerability is often expressed as part of the primal panic mechanism in fight, which is to resist and strike back, flight, which is escape or avoidance or excuse-making, or freeze, which is being unseen, unnoticed, or avoidant via inaction. Elements that comprise or influence our sense of vulnerability are probability, which is the possibility or likeliness of a situation or outcome arriving, impact, which is the magnitude or degree of harm or detriment to our being be that physical or psycho-emotional. And influence, which is the confidence and capability of our skills to prevent or address negative outcomes. Examples of points of vulnerability which invoke fear are but are not limited to the unknown, as previously discussed. What is unknown is undefined, and so one is unable to assess or control the situation. This attacks the sense of capability and confidence, and thus our primary means to mitigate feelings of risk and threat. Insecurity, which is the fear that one does not possess the capability, quality, competence, or means to meet or manage a risk adequately. Our fear that one is unable to meet or live up to the expectations of another individual, of society, or of integrated demands or expectations one has placed upon oneself. Rejection and abandonment. This is a reflection of both the intimate and communal survival mechanisms responsible for our support circles and social safety nets. Here one feels vulnerable to such things as loss of relationships, being socially outcast, ostracized, ridiculed, etc. Assumptions, beliefs, and worldviews. What one believes or has been led to believe is a choice in that we know we have made it or have been brought into it. When evidence is provided to the contrary of a belief, it can threaten one's sense of identity. Particularly susceptible to this are those who are given to rigid-mindedness and over-identifying with their persona. This threat rattles the ego in that it speaks the underlying question of, if I was wrong about that, what else am I wrong about? In the sense of those who over-identify with the persona, this can undermine their entire sense of who they are. A challenge to one's worldview or belief system essentially triggers a crisis of faith in the self. People who are fearful and who feel vulnerable will usually double down in order to feel reassured that the self is still all right and intact. The fear of failure or success. This ties into the fear that one will be held to unrealistic standards and thus is doomed to fail no matter how hard one tries. Or that one is innately terrible at something and thus, if one is actually successful, it will challenge the assumption of identity and reflect on past failures. This can also manifest as the feeling that once a success is finally achieved, one will never be able to meet the challenge to surpass it. Interestingly enough, the fear of failure and the fear of success are often confused for one another because they tend to exhibit very similar symptoms, primarily those of self-sabotage, procrastination, and other avoidant behaviors. Combating fear. One of the best ways to understand and eventually overcome one's fear is by actively engaging in cognitive exercises. This involves confronting the situation or thought patterns and mitigating the fear response by focusing on a few key questions, such as, what am I thinking? Which integrates feelings, thoughts, and movements. What am I feeling? Which integrates feelings, thoughts, and movements as well, but it also assists emotional stability and invokes the name it to tame it response, also known as the labeling effect. What do I want? Which involves cognitive integration. How am I getting in my way? Which involves conscious recognition of and learning from mistakes. What do I need to do differently? This invokes executive functioning, planning, goal setting, and insight. In closing, we are often so caught up in protecting ourselves and defending ourselves from a hostile external or even internal environment that we forget vulnerability is an integral part of being alive. Feeling vulnerable is scary, but in order to live authentically, it is a fear that must be embraced. Commonly perceived as a weakness, it is a fact that some of the bravest and most fulfilled individuals are also those who allow themselves to be vulnerable, to risk their safe havens, and open themselves to life, growth, and experience. There is never a guarantee that all will be well, that one will not be hurt or disappointed, make mistakes, or fail at something. However, without risk, there can be no reward. Bravery is not exhibited in the complete lack of fear. It is exhibited by being afraid and doing it anyway.